Hello, I'd like to welcome all of you to the presentation. I'm going to say I'm quite new at this. This is the first time I've ever done this, so please bear with me as I'm learning, as hopefully all you are. During this time, don't feel, if you have questions, I'd like to open it up anytime, any place in a sense of what you want to ask. The intent here is to in many respects, share experiences of what I've seen and what I witness, what makes good auditors, internally and even from a registration standpoint. When Karen approached me on this, it was a little challenging in a sense in the respect that I had to really think about what are these habits that make people feel good about their auditors coming to the organization to help them. And in many respects, we seem to always know when we don't have good auditors. And in a sense, I'm going to probably work that situation both ways to identify what I see out there as downfalls of auditors and what can we do to work around those downfalls to really make our audits internally and, in a sense, demand more out of our registrars to really bring value to the audit process within our organization. So with that, what I'd like to do is sort of, what is an auditor's crucial role? It first starts off with good auditors have to understand customer focus and the organization they're about to audit. And I'm going to get into that quite deeply when we go to the next slide. But the focus is going to dictate the type of management system we should expect to see of the organization, how tight of controls they should have to function, and try to understand, in many respects, who their customers are in the market segment they're going after. The auditor also needs to understand management systems and how processes play a role in that management system. The holistic perspective. I see many auditors understand processes, but then they don't understand how it impacts the rest of the organization, which then ties to audit planning and prep. To do a good audit, we have to be able to plan and prep for it and understand what we should be looking for. And this then dives into what a role of a checklist truly is. Too many times I see the checklist becomes the audit, and that's not what it should be. And then how do we develop a good checklist? The other things we need to understand as an auditor is communication and the skills that are needed in when to ask the right questions, so to speak, and then listening. I jokingly say a lot of the listening skills we can use at our home. Being a guy, you sort of have a tendency of talking more than listening, and listening plays a critical role in understanding when you are listening for key things that help you understand that organization's management system and how it goes together. And last but not least, the factual approach. As auditors, we can't go by gut feel. We can't go, I don't like it. We have to have proof to support the position we're really we're taking. If there is a nonconformance, we have to be clear and concise. And then along with that, as auditors, a lot of times we have to verify the closure from the auditee, and understanding that not all audit nonconformances require corrective actions. And so we must understand when a correction will be enough to fix the problem at hand, because it isn't systemic. It's a one-time event with low risk possibilities. So those are the things that I'd like to cover in this hour. And again, open any questions that you can submit. I got the screen here. Like I said, I'm learning new technology here too, so hopefully this will work. So the first step here, and I pulled it up out of the 8 quality management principles. And a lot of these slides come from the lead auditor training class, so you see the copyrighted dates are probably going to vary. The discussion of, and one of the best things I thought happened in the 2000 version of ISO were these 8 managing principles. And the starting off with customer focus. And a lot of times people don't understand what's really being talked about when they say customer focus. Understand your current and future customer needs. In other words, really as an auditor, we should be viewing this as what is the market segment this organization is working towards to meet, to satisfy the customer. So in many respects, it's up to then the leadership management to help identify why do you exist as an organization? To provide unity of purpose. A lot of times that will start with the organization's mission statement and vision. The mission, why you exist, what are you good at? What do you sell? And then the vision, where do you want to go? And that should tie directly to the market segment that they're trying to support, which then we can dictate who the customer is and what that focus is. And it's interesting, I was just at a client a few weeks ago where they're looking at now expanding into a whole different field. It was a machine shop which is looking now into doing fabrication welding on top of it. And the good part about it is with focus is they're asking their customer, okay, what is your future and where can we be a part of it? And why they're looking for this is because they want to see what capabilities they have to build into the organization to meet maybe these future needs so they can stay abreast of the market segment they're trying to support. So the neat thing is, as an auditor, we can ask, what is the focus and where are you going? And part of this can be part of the quality objectives to help drive the organization for improvement and change. So the leadership and focus as part of the management review and involvement when performing an audit become very critical as part of the conversation. So understanding that focus and that leadership will help then you decide and define what are the right amount of controls inside this organization to meet these needs of our customer and to ensure that we have quality or have defined quality so everybody understands things and we're all on the same page. So the important part is looking at it from, we have this management system and what is it supporting? What kind of customer is it supporting? Excuse me. So with that, what we have here on the next slide is a cost curve. If I understand the type of management system you have, we understand the whole focus of a management system is to ensure consistency and predictability, and that is a lot of power. If I can predict outcome of your process in your management system, I can control it. That's a lot of power. And if I don't have a well-defined management system and it leaves it up the chance for people to do their own thing, my operating costs are going to be going up. But in the same respect, I can over-control. And if I over-control through the management system, where I have a ton of signatures to get something approved, for instance, my operating costs go up. So what we're looking for, based on the type of management system that needed to be created to support the customer focus, is optimization. What's the right amount of control? And here's where our audits can help us maintain the right amount of control. And here's the downside that I see. We train our auditors very well to find the holes in the system. But if our auditors have a good understanding of the management system and customer focus and direction, we should also train them to look for the opportunities And what do I mean by opportunities? Where you might have outgrown some controls. Controls that maybe in the beginning were needed, but they're no longer needed now because we've matured as an organization. And typically what happens then, we keep those things in place even though we may not really need them. So I always like to use the good example of when I was working at Texas Instruments on military type items back in the early 80s. Back in the early 80s, we had some documentation that was written in such a way where it would dictate the color pen we used to sign off everything. But at the time that was a good thing because copier machines could not see blue ink, so we had to mandate the color of black and red. But over time, copier machines changed, technology changed. And so the need to show, to have, black or red only pens was no longer needed because when we made copies, blue ink would show up. So the requirement became obsolete, but we kept it. And the downside is when the government audited us, they saw us not following our own procedure because the need wasn't there, but we didn't change it. And our auditors didn't catch it. And so what I'm really trying to say is we need to ensure that our auditors look both ways. Not only where we need to tighten controls based on the type of business we're in, but we also need to help them identify opportunities to get rid of stuff when no longer needed. We've outgrown it. And so that's where audits can be used to help us optimize our management system, because that optimization is always a moving target. And what do I mean by moving target? It's in constant change, state of flux because our world changes. And so the audits help keep us stay abreast of these changes and keep us in that optimization point to ensure that we're not only effective but efficient. And so that is the ultimate goal of our audits, to ensure that we have the right amount of controls and it's functioning properly and it meets the requirements that we've stated we wanted to meet. Because, as going through so many companies, you look at some and they overkill a lot of times, and no one's going to want to follow the methodology defined because it's too much. So we have to make sure we can optimize it, but still get the desired results. So with that understanding, we have to look at it from a management system standpoint. And if we look at the ISO 9000, which is the most typical standard we audit to these days, or ISO 9 based standard, the customer focus is really the priority of the standard, understanding who our customer is, and then creating a strategy and direction. Policies and quality objectives are a subset of those business strategies and directions, which then show operations management. And if you look at ISO, that's what it really is, which then delivers product. So if you think about it, ISO outlines almost the value stream map if you're into lean. And it's supported by human resources, the management and legal requirements, and also supported by EHS management systems, your 14,000 and 18,001 for health and safety. But also we have then a reporting mechanism if we're a publicly traded company with SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley. And you'll find there's a lot of overlap with all these management systems. But the point is, ISO 9, or the auditing of ISO 9 or quality management systems, is really the backbone that in a sense deliver the product that make the organization work or deliver the service that they may provide. But all these things interact, and as an auditor we need to understand how all these things interact, because what we may want to do or need to do for, say, environmental can impact us in quality, or vice versa. So from that perspective, we look at a management system, and we have all these processes that really form the informational change. They're integrated, interdependent, and they interact with each other. And you have a key process, but there are support processes that make that key process work, and then monitoring processes. And so as an auditor, we need to understand how all these things work together and how they all interact. So with that said, if I look at the audit trail example and say I'm looking at a production process, which the key clause is 7.5.1, how we verify the requirements of meeting the ISO clause, we're verifying it through the schedule and the contractual agreement on what we agreed that we're going to build for that customer for that time. When we do an audit, we're always going to be, when we're doing interviews, checking people's qualifications and trainings. We're checking roles and responsibilities to ensure the right authorization and the right authority has been given to that responsibility, and that the information they're using is controlled and it's the right information. In other words, giving people the information they need to be successful in their job. We're then also verifying the schedule and how it falls into the contract. We're looking at the acceptance records. Could be in process, could be close to the final. And we're looking at all the other control things that they may have as an organization to verify, is their production control working? So one of the things I see a lot, especially with the registrars, a lot of the audits are still elemental based throwback from the 94 and of the ISO standard, and they're not focusing in on the process as much and how all these other clauses, in a sense, interact and work together to make production, the production process work. So if I look at purchasing, a simple process, their role is to buy raw materials. Now, where do they get that information to buy raw materials? Well, from the design. The bill of material could come from the customer or their own design group. And then their production control folks, or scheduling, whatever you want to call them, is going to tell the buyer what to buy, when to buy, and how many to buy. And of course, we just don't let anyone off the street buy the raw material. So we have controlled conditions. And what are those controlled conditions? A defined methodology for the buyer to buy. Controlled methodology of who they can buy from and how much they can buy. And then that information will flow to the supplier, but it also should be flowing then to the receiving people, because receiving should know, when something's coming in, so they're ready to get it off the truck, so to speak. Receiving inspection needs to know, so they realize they have the capabilities to perform the inspection that are required from what buyers are buying and when it should be available. Production and manufacturing should understand when this raw material is coming in. And the control people, the production control people, should also. Because if it doesn't come in, it messes up their schedule. So it's this understanding of how things flow, and you can then identify the control points in the records as an auditor of what should be available. For me to be for them to be successful, and are they following it, and is it working for them? So, and I know this is a busy screen. So if I look at purchasing, the process with the clauses, I get inputs from these clauses, in a sense, 7.1, 7.2, 7.3. The buyer performs to 7.4.1 and 2, and the output 7.4.3. to verify I got what I wanted. But you see, the buyer gets influenced by all these other clauses. Again, they have to understand how they can recognize when they're working off the latest and greatest revisions of documents. They contain records and should know where they are of assessment of suppliers. And when the auditor is running out of questions, they usually ask, what's the policy and quality objectives? How have they been qualified for the job, and how they fit into the production scheduling piece. And in a lot of cases, in 741 purchasing, they need to understand how identification and traceability is required. And with RoHS, the European requirement of knowing what's in your product, you may have some more traceability requirements than what you're normally used to. And the buyer may even address handling issues. And we know the buyer gets involved typically when there is a nonconformance, which then could lead to a supplier corrective action. So as you can see, as you work around this circle, the buyer gets involved in almost all of these areas in many respects in some way, shape, or form. So we need to be aware of that and how all these things interact, for the success of this process to work. And if, like I said, where I see some of the downfall is where the auditor is just auditing the straight line, the inputs, the process, the output, without really digging into all these other pieces that support the purchasing process. So when you get started with an audit, the first thing that we have to define is a scope statement. And the scope really identifies the audit criteria I'm going to be measured against, the extent and the boundaries of the audit. The boundaries are the fence posts, in a sense. What processes or activities are inside that fence post, within that boundary? And we should look at site locations too. How many are there? Is it singular or is it multiple? And then what are those processes at each site that are being performed? And again, from a registrar perspective, here's where I think most organizations could spend a little more time defining what are their boundaries and what are the processes inside the boundaries. A lot of times what I see is they just identify the clauses they do without really clearly explaining what are the processes. What are the processes that are being performed inside this boundary? And what this does help, especially organizations that have, say, corporate, and corporate isn't certified, but you are, it helps define that firewall, as I call it, where your responsibility and role begins and corporate's ends. So you define who's supposed to do what when between the two, because one thing is, from an audit perspective, you do not want to be held accountable for something you cannot control. So writing a good scope statement then helps identify what is under your realm of authority and what is not, especially when you're dealing with corporate. It also will help what you're outsourcing for processes and help define it, and then the way you control it. The other key thing is then please communicate. Those people are going to be involved in the audit because they're part of that scope. And once you identify what the audit scope is, now I can break it up and define my audit schedule. And again, here's where a lot of companies, because they don't have a well-defined scope statement, it's hard to then identify what are all the processes that we may need to be auditing. What's inside the boundary that we want this certificate for. So developing a process-based audit plan. The beauty of the ISO-based programs, and most of the audits these days, even with the Code of Federal Regulations, are demanding almost the same processes. And I like to break my processes up into three categories. The first, you have the support processes. Pretty much any ISO-based program, you're going to have them, like management involvement, which includes review, internal communications, setting, of the policies, then their involvement. Also, your improvement processes, which would include corrective and preventive action. Internal audits, document control, record control. I like to mix also customer satisfaction and focus together. And the reason for that from an audit perspective is if I understand the focus, I can now see, based on your satisfaction measurements, how you're meeting that focus or that want and need of the customer. The other process that everybody has is training and qualifications. And training and qualifications, starts off with when you hire a person in, so to speak, what is going to be their role, responsibility, and the skill levels and education and experience levels that you would like to have them have before you hired them in. And then that's the qualification piece. That typically can be done in a job definition or, a combination of areas. But then you build off that to say, okay, what other training then is needed for them to be successful in the job that I want them to do? So as an auditor, we're looking at the qualifications and how the organization defined it, looking at the experience of the person that we may have interviewed, and then see where maybe the holes are, and then how did the organization fill the holes for that person so they can be a productive employee. That's one example. So, those are the support processes and key processes that we'd be looking at. Then you have the realization process, in a sense, order entry all the way to pack and ship and calibration. And then what I like to call optional processes that I break it down into. And what are those optionals? Case in point, if maintenance is very critical to the success of the business, typically when I do process of production, I would cover the maintenance piece. But if I see if it's very critical for the organization, that if this machine went down, case in point, Cardinal Glass has a glass furnace. That furnace goes down, they're in big trouble. That's their business. So it's very important then maintenance is broken out, because it's going to be a deeper audit because of that. So facilities and maintenance, if depending on the critical nature of it in the organization, if it is very critical, I'll break it out into the optional. If your organization is under legal regulations for its product, then I'll probably break it out, because what I'm looking for then is, okay, who's responsible to keep the organization up to date, and then how does it get communicated, these changes in the legal and regulatory requirements. And as companies have become very dependent on IT, say you're dealing with electronic signatures and such, then your computer system and ERP system becomes highly critical to the success of your business, and I'll break that out under optional also. But what we're trying to do is formulate the plan then to reflect your organization. And then what we can do from there, once we identify all the processes, we can identify the process owners. And so if we go to the next slide, you can see here's an example of one. And here you see all the processes that have been defined. This was a job shop, heavy fab shop. And as you can see, you got the management, pardon me as I'm trying to know how to do this. You have the management involvement, the improvement process, corrective preventive action, internal audit process, customer focus, satisfaction, control of documents and records, and training and job qualifications. So you see these basically support processes that in almost every audit that I've done are always going to be there. Then here you can see the realization of product, from quotes all the way down to inspection and test non-conforming product. Then on this side, try the arrow, I guess, you can see who's responsible for each of these processes. And this is one way that I'll usually set up an audit schedule. The X's then will signify what, that they have not been audited, and if I wanted to make this an audit schedule, just replace the X's with a name and a date, and I have my schedule. And this is a good way to track what audits have been done and what still needs to be done. You can create a ledger up here, and you'll find that I break probably processes down into smaller events than in a lot of the audits. And the reason I do that is typically I try to spend about 2 hours per audit on average so I can plan a day. So from an outsider coming into an organization, typically you can do about 4 process audits a day. So you're breaking it down into manageable pieces. Especially with internal auditors, a lot of you may not have the time to do a whole system audit in one sitting, let alone maybe a whole day give away. So by breaking it up into smaller processes, you have the opportunity to basically do an audit half a day and do what you're supposed to, your regular job the rest of the day. So laying it out and planning, becomes real critical, and most organizations have to find their comfort zone or their comfort level. Again, this is a tool I use, and I pass it on to a lot of my clients, and it seems to work very well for them. But it does identify then the process owners. Then the other thing I like to create, once I have defined the processes, and you can see here on the left side all the processes, I then create the clauses and try to identify the types of clauses that are going to be touched during this audit. So as you can see, the X's then would signify every time I did a management involvement, I should touch these clauses during the audit. Now this company didn't do design, that's why you see NA here. So your audit trail, when you do an audit, should be able to then map back or reflect that, yes, when I did management involvement, we're looking at the quality management system and how management worked with it. We looked at their roles and responsibility and discussed the focus, and also the review, the record of the review, and everything else involved in that. So it gives me a guideline of what other clauses should be touched besides, say, with management involvement 5.6 or management review, which typically then gets hit. So it gives that guideline, and then my audit trail that I record in my audit report then reflect this. Any questions, type it in, or I guess holler. I don't know if they have voice, Karen. They can holler in anytime.
Okay, well, we do have one question out here. Pat asked, for the systemic interactions you described, how much of the interaction of 9,000 and 14,000, or of sections of 9,000, would you expect to see documented for an organization?
You mean if they blend them together? Is that the question, Pat? I'm not quite sure.
Pat?
Yes, that's essentially it. You talk about, excuse me, showing all of your slide show a number of interactions.
Oh yeah.
I'm wondering, do you expect to see that in the quality manual or somewhere in the quality system documentation?
This is where the quality manual becomes real key, where they ask for that sequence and interaction. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I look at, the beauty of the standard is it doesn't require you to regurgitate the ISO standard for a quality manual, thank God. Look at the quality manual as the roadmap. And that sequence and interaction shows how all these procedures interact. Now, I wouldn't look for the environment and health and safety, if they were doing 14 or 18, unless they were trying to merge everything together. The scope of the audit would be dictated by what they say they want audited, either quality, environment, or health or safety. They may be on their own. So I would not expect, if they wanted it separated as the organization, that they'd address environment in the quality manual or show how they interacted. But that's where now a good auditor may encourage, or as I like to say, mentor that to happen. Don't be afraid to merge these things because there's so much overlap. It's just the focus, the end focus is different. Quality is on product. Environment is how do we reduce basically our carbon footprint. And health and safety, keep my folks in good shape. But they all do a lot of the same things. So depending on the company is going to dictate how you deal with it. I wouldn't expect it unless they put it inside the scope of the audit when they define the scope. So I guess as an auditor, I try never to come in assuming what I expect to find. I try to let them tell me what they're doing and how they control it, because what I'm after is consistency, predictability, and did they meet the requirements of the standard. So how was that for a non-answer, right, Pat?
No, I think that pretty well covered it.
Okay.
So thank you.
Yeah. Good question. As companies are starting to do both and trying to be environmentally friendly, and also can't forget about OSHA, these things just overlap tremendously, and I can't say that enough. And these are really management systems. As I like to say, how do you want to run your business? And it's not this quality thing over there. It's not this, it's how do we make our customers happy? So if we get into the auditor preparation, we want to make sure we allow sufficient time. Since ISO 9000, 2000 came out, and now 2008, there's not many requirements for documented procedures. So I can't stress enough the importance of prepping yourself. And you're going to find, obviously, I got my own baggage. I'm not a big fan of canned checklists. Canned checklists pre-written. And the reasoning for that is because typically they become, if they're pre-written by somebody else, they're just a regurgitation of the ISO standard. And your questions are going to be very vague. And they have to be, because the standard is vague. It's written for everybody and anybody. And so my suggestion is, when the auditors are prepping to do an audit, and you should create your checklists off your own documents, your own procedures. And at the time you're creating those checklists, you're verifying your procedures, your processes still meet the requirements of the standard on paper or any legal or regulatory. And that's why you see I have this in red, and I'll throw my highlighter too, because this is the key to get into an audit and get into it fast and deep, quickly. And the reasoning I'm saying that is because if you're sitting there trying to audit off the standard alone and you didn't do the prep work for documentation, you got to ask a lot of questions to first learn what's going on. Where if I got your procedure, it's telling me the audit trail. What forms do you have? What records should be available, and where are they, please? So a lot of times what you can do, especially internal audits, what you can do is get this information up front, and if everything's electronic, you can do a lot of audits on your own, and you don't need that person to be interviewing right away. You can dig up a lot of things immediately, be it from your desk if things are on the computer, or tracking down the file drawer that you need to look at. And as you're digging through the trail and you find issues or things aren't quite clear, you can then bring the people into the audit process. There were many times back in the late 90s I was doing audits of companies via the internet and a conference call. You know, it was before you had these things like go to my webinar or go to my meeting existed. But we were able to do audits. You know, there was one audit I was supposed to do in Israel, but I was trying to decline because they were having bombs explode over there as back then. And it wasn't a good time to be there. But we were able to accomplish the audit via a conference call and an internet, you know, where everything was online, the records were online, and so through conversation we were able to do the majority of the audit, you know, and meet the requirements and audit objectives. So bringing this internal, there's a lot of things you can do, you know, to verify effectiveness of your management system without always doing the interview of the person right away. You know, you still have to do it, and you still want to do it to make sure these people understand what's the expectation is and what's supposed to happen. But if I know what should be there from your own procedures, it's going to accelerate the audit, and I have then the opportunity to get into it fast and deep and quick. And that's the key. The other thing is I want to make sure I understand the regulations or have a good idea what should be there and look at previous audit findings. What was found before my time? And here's the beauty of an internal audit too. You guys know where the skeletons are. And if I'm going down an audit trail, a path, should I grab the good projects or should I grab the ones that I know had problems? You know, in this case I would grab the ones that I know had problems because I want to try and find out why it had a problem so we can find out why things fell through the cracks. You know, internal audits should find more than the registrar audit. So as your certified, your registrar auditor comes in, we like to see audit non-conformances being found. I'd rather see you guys find them than me. And the reason being is that means your system's working. Then you want to notify your auditee when the audit's coming, so you have a better idea, you know, so they can be prepared for the audit. You know, you don't want to make it a surprise. And the reason being is when people are caught off guard like that, then they think you're trying to catch them at something. And I can't stress enough, you don't want to be a cop. This has to be a partnering relationship. And the focus is to make you a better organization. My experience is most organizations want a hard but fair audit. And that's what they should have, based on facts. So some rules that I like to think about the checklist. The audit checklist needs to be written for you, the user, nobody else. You know, the questions and statements are the starting point. And if you're writing it against the ISO standard, you're definitely going to have open-ended questions. You have to, because you're trying to learn what are they doing. But the key is here, if I can start here, write the checklist against your second and third tier documents, in other words, your procedures or work instructions. My questions now can be very direct and close-ended. I can get to the point quickly because your procedures point to where the proof should be. And I don't have to waste time. I can get down and deep quickly. And that's the point, because we have to be effective and efficient in what we're doing as auditors. So it's helpful then to identify and get these documents ahead of time if possible. When I do a registration audit, or what I do is ask them to have copies available for me, and I'll spend about 5 minutes cruising through them to verify, okay, what are the auditable statements that I want to look for? What are the records? What are the forms that they're using? And highlight them. So I make their procedures and my checklist. Now, if I don't have that opportunity to have that, then I got to go back to the standard. And then my checklist, oops, more looks like these kind of things. Say if I had to do the order process 7.2 in the standard, here are the things I'd probably put down on a checklist. And it doesn't have to be a question, could be a statement, could be anything, as long as it's a tickler for you. Review the sales contract ordering process. Basically, I'm telling myself they got to explain it to me. I don't see a procedure, so I got to understand what they're doing. Then I want to know how they maybe review the orders, and let's see some records, please. And then I want to see how they put it into their system. Typically, this is going to be a computer system, so you may be sitting in front of a computer screen. And then how does that person taking the order know you can deliver to that contract? The capabilities. And what does capability mean? Can I design it? Can I build it? Can I deliver it on time at the location that you want it? And last but not least, it's a tickler to choose 3 contracts maybe and walk it through the procedure. See what happened with it. Now, as internal auditors, getting back to, you guys know where the skeletons are. Choose 3 contracts. You think you're going to choose the good ones, or should I choose the ones you know you had problems with? What I'd like to do is choose the ones you had problems with, again, to see why it failed. And always remember, the answer to the questions are going to lead you to the next question. I always use my mother as a good auditor. When you're a young teenager, my ma had great questioning techniques. When I came in to the home late, my ma was waiting for me, and her first question was, "Where you been?" And of course, if you're an evasive teenager, your answer is going to be out. Well, my mom's first question on the checklist was, "Where you been?" And then based on my response will dictate what she does later. And obviously she didn't get the right information she needed, so she asked me more questions that weren't on the checklist, like, "Who were you with? Can I get some names, please?" So sooner or later, she used the checklist, so to speak, to get her started. But after that, once you're started, you follow the process flow. And I can't emphasize enough, checklists are there to keep you organized and on track. And like I said, I'm not a big fan of canned checklists due to the fact that they become the audit. And all people do is check the question off. They don't give enough detail that they really need to support, well, what did you look at? So that's why this slide is in here. The checklist is a servant, not the master. You got to look at the whole operation and how things are interacting with it. Don't let it limit you. And because a lot of times I see they put the blinders on. And as we call it then, you do a surface audit. And that's all you do. Now we get into the human factor. Any questions on how processes or how the auditor should understand how everything fits from a management system, and then how it breaks down into the process and how things should be interacting?
There are no questions in the queue. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and type them into the question box, and we'll make sure that Russ gets them answered for you by the end of the webinar.
Okay. Well, keep plugging away. So the human factor, like I say, the softer side of auditing. The human element. You're going to come across all different types of people and all different types of personalities. You're going to be dealing with people that never had a good day in their life, and you'll be dealing with people that never had a bad day in their life, and a lot in between. So we, as auditors, have to adjust to that person, that moment, at that day. And we also need to understand they would rather be somewhere else. It's sort of humorous. When you go looking to interview some people, man, they run away. Oh, the auditor's coming, the registrar. So they run away from you. And this is where we have to try to build trust. And trust is tough to build sometimes, especially when the environment of an organization is very challenging. So we got to understand the auditee would rather be somewhere else. Auditing, being an auditee is no fun a lot of times. But what I like to try to do when doing an audit is tell the auditee, hey, it's brag time. If you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, there's nothing to be worried about, and be proud of what you do. So that's a good icebreaker, is communicating that to them. Be proud of what you do. We're not here to see if you're doing anything bad. We're seeing if the system, the management system, is working for you the way you need it to be. So the auditee is going to be nervous, stressed, worried, so we got to be sensitive. Try to understand their situation and work environment. You're going to find I got a lot of rules, and this is one of the rules. Do no harm, and try to protect the auditee. And what I mean by protect the auditee, in your reports, always identify the situation, not the person, when there is a negative. The sad part is, and I've been through audits like this, where we had a finding on a situation in the morning, and they walked the auditee or that person who was part of that situation out the door that afternoon. What message did that send to the rest of the people? And try to do a fair, decent audit under that circumstance. It's very challenging, because the last thing we want to do as auditors is to get somebody fired. But there are companies out there like that. So we have to not only understand the organization's market segment, but the work environment that these people work under. Watch their body language. Tells you a lot. Their perception is their reality. If they have a negative perception, this is really hard to change. It can be changed, but we have to be able to change it by giving them a positive experience. And it's going to take multiple positives before we get to the negative. Get rid of the negative. But it only takes one negative to change a positive into a negative. So we have to make sure that we make this as painless as possible. And I like to use humor. It's a great tool. I make fun of myself. It's safe humor. And I'm an easy target. So humor is a great tool for people. It's safe humor if you make fun of yourself. And your quirks, your individual quirks, like I said, the only one that can get mad is yourself. But it's a great way to break the ice. So the human factors in auditing starts with communications, personalities, emotions, persuasions, and problem situations. So starting it off, communication. In reality, there is no such thing as a communication failure. We always communicate a message. The problem is sometimes it gets interpreted differently than we intended. Here's where I can joke about myself and my family. I may ask my wife something or tell her something, and she may interpret it completely different than I intended it. And so it's very important that we have clear, simple messages that we send to the auditee so they have an understanding. And, simple statements that we may be as innocent as possible, but may be interpreted differently. And so we have to be careful. And the failure of communication starts with not stating things clearly. Making sure that it's a simple message for people to understand. And so if you look at that, you have the deliverer, and we all have our baggage, as I call it, our own filters. And we have verbal communication and nonverbal. Rolling of the eyes. I got a teenage daughter. I can always tell when the message isn't quite good. The eyes roll at me. and they have their own personal filters, and then the interpretation and the feedback. So with this model, this communication model, we have to be aware of their other people's experiences and potential filters if possible. And sometimes we can pick up on some of this through introductions, you know, when we introduce ourselves with auditors, because I spend a little time introducing myself and trying to get to know them too, you know, just more to break the ice. And you can learn something about the auditee, which then you can try to adjust how you communicate with them. So the keys: clear, simple message. Don't talk down to them. Communicate. Request feedback. Make sure they understood what you're saying and listen to what they're telling you. Don't be thinking about the next question or going off somewhere else. You know, good eye contact is very helpful. And you keep getting feedback, keep communicating until you have a common understanding. We got to take the time. A lot of times we're so rushed, we don't take the time to communicate, and it can be misinterpreted in what we're trying to get after. So we got to understand our audit role. Obviously, our first auditor role is we verify conformance of the management system. That is ultimately our #1 goal. But our second goal is to educate the auditee, the importance, and at times interpretation of the requirements, and why this is important to the organization. Thirdly, from our auditor's perspective, a mentor. And what I mean by a mentor, you know, it's trying to push them to be better. And this can be a little dangerous if not done right. You know, it could border on consulting, and we got to be careful because we don't want to lose our independence. But, you know, more or less trying to help drive the organization, because your audits should help drive the organization to change and to be better. So we have to build trust. We can't go in trying to do I gotcha, because in reality auditing is power, and we have to be careful of that power. We don't want to be cops. The best systems are the ones that people buy into. And this is a challenge, because in reality a lot of times what we're trying to do is change behavior. And what's one of the hardest things to do with people? Change behavior. That can be very challenging. So as auditors, we need to recognize their management. We need to understand our own strengths, our own weaknesses, and the preferred style that we like to function under. Mine is more conversation. You know, you need to recognize how people differ, and again, their world that they deal with, and again, their workplace culture. Is it a positive one that is very accepting of ISO, or what the criteria that you're auditing against, or they're doing it more for the piece of paper because a customer told them to do it? And that comes out pretty clear. You can usually tell when that's the case. You know, a lot of times you can tell by opening meetings by who shows up from a registrar's perspective. You know, how bought in are they? A lot of times just by who's there and who you get to talk to. So the positive audits, the first thing is, if I don't know you or know the people, introduce yourself by name. Ask if you've been informed, ask if they've been informed about the audit. And here's good bedside manner from, in a sense, the doctor. Explain the purpose and the process that this person is going to go through. And what do I mean by go through? So they have an understanding of what you're after and why this is important to the organization. The other key point to say, something in this nature, explain its review of the management system, not a judgment on how well they are doing. I can't emphasize that enough. In fact, a lot of times I'll even add to that. If we do, if we have a problem, let's work together to try and get it fixed. Because sometimes people are wanting that opportunity to fix it, but something's stopping them. So an audit can be that help, that get it out in the open to get it fixed. And so as an auditor, we have to be very careful then how we may write the nonconformance so it's on the management system, not the individual. And so explain you'll be writing notes. I'll even say if you want to see what I'm writing, I'll show you. I'll be happy to show you. And I also then ask, turnaround is fair play. Do you have any questions of me? Again, trying to get an understanding of who that person is and the personality that I'm going to be dealing with. And then I can adjust my style and my questioning technique to that individual. So the communication techniques that we use as auditors, we first need to understand the auditee's role. Do I have the right person? Then get into the open questions or probing, the paraphrasing, reflective pauses. There's a time and place for each one of these to getting the information and making sure it's clear communication. So open-ended, what, how, tell me, show me. You're all from Missouri now. One of the areas that I do run into is a lot of the newer auditors don't go deep enough. They'll ask a question, the auditee answers it, but they don't follow it up to say, well, where's the proof that you can show me? And I can't emphasize that enough. And then dig into the proof. And what do I mean? Records. Not only look to see if they have the record, but read the record. A lot of times when you review corrective actions, I've seen it where people have signed off corrective actions when it's really not a corrective action. It's what we'll call a correction. And so how did you verify, the quick fix, so to speak? And how did you approve it as effective? Most of you must probably used to seeing, human error as root cause, and I trained them. So when we see things like that as part of a record, when they're showing it to you as an auditor, we got to dig a little deeper to say, okay, we have to now make sure that the record matches what should be happening. So it's the show me, and then read the record. See if it is correct. Paraphrasing, it's a reflection back. Did you understand what I'm telling you? And it makes sure that they know that you did understand. And it keeps things positive. And pauses. A lot of times I do pauses just to catch up on my note-taking. There is a deliberate silence, but it gets people to open up. People don't like quiet. So it encourages people to respond. Jokingly, though, when I get audited too, because RABQSA audits my lead auditor courses, if there is a pause, jokingly you can ask, "Are we done?" But in reality, it is a time for us to catch up as auditors on our note-taking, the details that we do need, but it also gives us opportunity to listen to what other people are saying. So we're multitasking. Then we get into fact-finding questions. This is the close-ended question, and we can get into this quickly, and these are really the key questions when we have their procedures. If we have their procedures in hand, I can dig right into it and say, hey, it says you have this. Can I see that, please? And it gets to the proof immediately. And, if you have questions that things don't make sense, you can then talk to the auditee and have a better understanding of what they're doing because you have that basic understanding through their SOP or their procedures. Summary statements then, usually at the end of the interview, recap, boil it down. You want to make sure they understand if there are nonconformances, what they are. Again, this is where now the education role comes into place. It's a good place to also demonstrate you've listened, ensure there is clarification, and you have audit or objective evidence to support the position you're going to take. But it also gives the auditee one more chance to explain their position and their, one more chance to say, hey, you missed that. Here's my proof to say I am doing it. So, the summary statements can be very critical and helpful. Now the big one, listening. There's different types of listening, and we got to be aware of it. Again, a lot of this, it's a good thing to practice at home with our significant others. You get the critical listening to separate fact from fiction. As an auditor, we definitely got to know this and verify everything with fact. And this is how we stay neutral. We don't get in an argument. The standard and the requirements in many respects are very clear. You need a record. Okay, do you have the record or not? And so this keeps us away from what we personally maybe like to see versus what absolutely has to be there. We have to be able to see the facts. Sympathetic listening. And this is where we want to be understanding to their situation without judging, but low empathy in many respects. Creative listening. Take their input seriously. But be careful with that, though, too. We got to get away from hearsay. We want to make sure that we definitely understand what the issue is, but we have to always back it up with proof. And as an auditor, we have to be open-minded. There's many different ways to do things and demonstrate control. So what we're after is, do you have the proof to show me that it's working for you, it's under control, and then it meets the requirements of the standard. So things to listen for, key information, name, points of compliance, results. Look for the hot buttons. And here's where your body language can really come into play. You can usually tell when you hit a hot button because the facial body language will give you insight into it. And so we have to be aware of what's going on and watching the auditee also. So things that would encourage your communication. Requesting information about the process to better understand. And again, if I understand their management system and I understand the processes that support it, this is a useful tool to understand what should be in place. A desire to work together. Again, empathy, equality. I'm a skills examiner, and I witness audit people trying to be lead auditors, and I do run into issues here sometimes where, sometimes there's an expectation that, I'm the lead auditor, and it shouldn't be that way. Treat others with respect and trust. And equality, that goes a long way. We're not trying to dazzle them with brilliance or baffle them with the other stuff. Treat them as people. Openness. We don't want to take sides. These things encourage good communication. And as auditors, we have to be able to communicate and communicate well. So questioning techniques, again, got to start with the understanding of who we're talking to. The checklist questions are the lead-in. We've got to be able to jump off. When asking questions, you need to follow the flow. Your procedures tell you that. And just as if you're interviewing for a job or you are interviewing somebody for a job, this is a skill that auditors need to have, a skill of interviewing for information. Again, I prefer conversational style. You may have to ask a question many different ways. And a reason for that is because every organization creates their own language, acronyms. And that becomes tough. In the communication sector of understanding all these acronyms. Now, internal auditors, hopefully you understand those. So as an auditor, here are sources of information. If you look at it, obviously interviews with employees, that's where it starts. But they should then point to us the documents, the records, the permits, the contracts, all these other items. They should be pointing to us. This is the starting point. And a lot of times we forget about websites. Websites can even show us a lot about an organization and how well things are doing. So these are the sources that an auditor we're looking for. We got to get to the meat of things. And your procedures tell me where all these things are. So when I do evaluate a management system, I'm looking for, is the process defined? Do they match authority with responsibility, and do they have the right amount of controls in place? So what am I going to look for? How are they measuring, and what are they monitoring, and what does it show me? And sometimes you have to ask, how do they come up with the calculation? Because sometimes they have, if you don't understand the calculation, you may not understand what the measurements are from. Case in point, I had one client, kept showing me a 98% quality level. But once I started digging into that calculation, they had everything and the kitchen sink in there, and a lot of it had nothing to do with quality. It was a summation of many different measurements, and some of those measurements weren't quality. So we have to ask, is the practice effective? In other words, meeting the acceptance criteria. And can they repeat it, or can they improve it? So these are the items we're always looking for. And if we audit non-documented activities, the key point is this one. We're doing all these other points, but the key is we verify that practice outputs and byproducts potentially, depending on the standard I'm auditing, meet what we want it to meet. So what's your proof? Just because it's not documented doesn't mean it's not happening. Okay. Thank you, Karen, for the minute thing.
You're welcome.
I know this is, So what we're after is the trail, inputs, process, output. So if I'm doing an audit process, a process audit, I'm looking for things I can grab onto to follow it through, much like maybe purchase orders, contracts, production runs, service call, product designs, or if I'm doing ISO 14, environmental aspects, job risk assessments. And if I'm auditing multiple processes, what I'm trying to do, take what I learned from one and carry it over into the next. And I have a saying, there are some things I have to burn in my brain, that when I'm doing a process audit, there are things that should become natural to me that I'm always looking for. And that's what we call the support processes, such as doc control, record keeping, qualifications. Whenever I'm doing an audit, these are the items that I burn in the brain. I should always be looking. So if I look at a flow, you can see here are the doc procedures that may exist in this example and the forms that they may be using. This is a sales order contract flow. And so what I'd be looking for is then the completed forms, because they're my records, and ultimately how they put it into the computer system. So you pick up maybe a quote and carry it through and just follow the flow and see how it happens till you get to the end. Did it happen right? And when, here's something too, you'll probably hopefully never look at a form the same. Look at all the different clauses that I can follow with looking at one form. So we have to understand how all these support processes interact, because with one form, look at all the clauses I can walk down. So as an auditor, this is what I mean by reading the records and making sure that things are done properly. And what we're after is proof. We're looking for the proof. And I can't emphasize this enough. I don't know how many audits that I see or records where I don't see, I'll read the audit finding or nonconformance and I'm wondering, what is the issue? What is your proof to support that position? And it gets a little frustrating, not only, well, I'm sure it's very frustrating for you all that have to deal with it. So what auditors' evidence for effectiveness and our audit trail should support this, we're looking for defined systems. Are they giving them the right resources to be successful? And what I mean we, the employees. Do they have the right amount of controls in place? And again, consistent, repeatable, and if there are problems, how do they react? Do they do a correction, corrective action, preventive action, or maybe a need for continual improvement? So what's very critical, and this is something all auditors can improve upon, is note-taking. The success of your audit is going to be based on the clarity, accuracy, and precision of your notes. I like to say details, details, details. Your notes need to identify exactly what was found and why it didn't meet the requirements. And you need to have the proof, the objective or audit evidence. You're going to find then good audit notes are the key to a successful audit report and demonstrate the auditor's effectiveness. And that is critical. That is critical. So if I document a nonconformance, I want to get the reference, quote the requirement from the audit criteria, the standard, or their own procedure, or all the above. State exactly what was found. You know, any way to describe it. The details that describe how it failed, and if I can, take copies. And nonconformance, this is real key, should be stated so that it explains itself and can be understood with no further auditor input. You should be able to read it and go, aha. I understand it. I know what the issue is. Because in reality, as auditors, this is the problem statement. This is the statement that is critical for the person to fix the problem. So here's an example of nonconformance and that I had in an audit a while back. They had a system, this was a job shop, no methodology defined for making changes or marking up customer designs on customer drawing. And as you see, here's my proof customer drawing. Rev D had changes with no evidence of customer approval. So there's my proof. They didn't have a methodology to find how to do it, but yet they're doing it. And then changes need to be identified with evidence of approval, and there's the ISO clause. And typically, even paraphrasing the requirement of the ISO is very helpful. So closing the audit interview. Some of the key points when done auditing. Summarize with the auditee what was found. Tell them the good points. Don't be afraid to say you did well here. When a nonconformance or observation is found, explain why it's an issue. If you do major and minor, don't tell them. Talk to somebody else first to get a say it is a major or minor. Personally, for internal audits, I don't like them internal auditors to use major and minor. You got nonconformance, you got to fix it. Let your correction versus corrective action system separate severity. Explain again, it's review of the system, and explain there is a nonconformance. The name will not be in it, just the facts of what the issue is. And most importantly, ask if they have questions and thank them for their time. You know, it's very critical we thank them for their time. They spent time talking to us out of their day. You know, this is how you make things positive. And then someone's got to do a system analysis, you know, however you do it. with the registrar, the lead auditor does, and we track where our nonconformances are and see if we have any trends. And then hopefully that can drive other improvements. So once we get into that, then it's process or audit reporting. And here's where I see a weakness again, the details of what did you look at? What was the trail? If I had to, could I repeat your audit? Could I duplicate it? So I'm looking for the duplication in the sense of, do you have a trail where I could dig up all the things you looked at and I should be able to come up with the same conclusion? So one of my audits a long time ago, as you can see from the date there, here's the trail, the details, where you can see if someone had to, they could duplicate the audit. And that's the point. And if I put this in my audit report, I don't need to keep the checklist because it tells me here what I looked at. The records, the documents, the equipment reviewed, and how we dug into it. So this is an easier way and make then your audit reports electronic. So writing an audit report, you want to gather all the information from your team. If you are a lead, you write it. I do recommend an executive summary. I like to try and put the executive summary on the first page. Why? Because top management will read it, and hopefully we made it well enough that they'll read the rest of the audit report. Again, non-conformance should be written with details, the proof. Those are critical. And here's a report format I like. And as you can see, here's my audit trail. The clauses that I would cover, that I covered based on the trail, and any non-conformance observations. Very simple report format. Typically, if I do one process audit, it's a 2-page report. All electronic. I don't have to keep my audit notes because I can duplicate them from my trail. It makes life easy and it's acceptable. And I know I'm running out of time. 5 minutes, 2 questions in queue. Want to hit those? We'll hit the 2 questions, Karen.
One is actually looks like you're heading right into it. Could you provide more detail on the distinction between correction versus corrective action?
Okay. Correction is, and this is the thing, if you go into the definition, a lot of times correction is rework, repair, but if I have a low risk, I guess how I separate correction from corrective action, there are triggers of corrective action, and those triggers are as follows. Do I have a trend? And you guys decide, this is your threshold of pain. The second trigger is this a high liability risk? I can't afford to do it that way. The third trigger for corrective action is it a high dollar amount? And you define that level. The fourth trigger, failed to meet contract of the customer in court of law. That's painful. And the fifth trigger is failed to meet a regulatory or industry regulation. If I say yes to any of those, then I'm going to do a corrective action. All else can suffice with a correction. And let me go to the next slide here quickly on that, because I know I'm running out of time. Your registrars request corrective action on everything. So they have to understand that a correction sometimes is the only, I'll go to the next one, be able to recognize when a correction is the only feasible fix because it's not cost effective to do anything else. Case in point, you find that single document out of control. Does that mean your system's broke? No. So you fix it, get on with life. What's the other one, Karen? What's the other question?
The other question is, can you discuss some points of your experience on the effectiveness of auditing via the telephone, web, or conference? That remote auditing.
Oh, the remote stuff.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of those. Personally, I don't like them, and a lot of it is because I like to see people, but that's me. You can do a pretty good job if everything's electronic. And there are some things we can do that way from a registration standpoint, cover a fair amount of the audit in that manner. Those would be, if your registrar comes in, if you notice all he does is sit in the conference room, because all you're doing is feeding them records and procedures. In some cases, that's pretty much the only thing you can do. For those type of process audits, that would work. But when you got to get out on the shop floor and see what's actually going on, or actually going on at the desk, that's where it doesn't quite work. Personally, it's a nice way to supplement it, but I wouldn't do it completely. But there is a time place where it works.
Great,
and
thanks.
Look at that. Yeah. Any other questions? Did I make it in time?
I have 12:58, so we do have time for one more question if somebody wants to get one in very quickly. Otherwise, you can go ahead and if you have a summary.
Well, the summary of it is take the time, be prepared, take detailed notes so you can put details in your nonconformance. I can't stress that enough. Detailed notes, good audit trail, and recognizing sometimes the only feasible fix is a correction, not a corrective action. How do you deal with corrective action on random variation? And that's the challenge. Nobody wants to do the wrong thing, and the goal is always 100%, but I have yet to find a perfect process, and that's the key. Details, understand management systems, how they all interact, and so on. And thank you very much, y'all.
Well, thank you, Russ. I appreciate you taking the time to put this together. It was a wealth of information, and I, for one, liked what you had to say about establishing trust. I think that, in my experience, has always been very important for getting the best out of your audits. So thank you for highlighting that, and thank you for being with us. And I will get this recording out to everybody just as soon as I can. And also look in your inbox for the survey regarding the webinar. This is only our third one, so we're definitely looking for feedback on how to make these more valuable. And thank you all for being here.
Yeah. My first one, so please bear with me. So I know there's a lot of talk and not much interaction. I apologize, but it's a hard topic to address in a short period of time.
It certainly is. And thank you again.
Thank you. Have a great day.